I wanted to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that reduces the risk and costs of cross-border transactions. As a board member, there are few better feelings than making a suggestion which adds quick material value to your organisation. I remember when one of our board members saved us $50,000 with a quick introduction to a group discount scheme for one of our key suppliers. I continue to feel grateful to this day. Alt21 can offer exactly this kind of quick win for board members. By using their foreign exchange and hedging services, you could reduce your company's costs by 90%. For a company that has just 10 million foreign exchange exposure through its revenues or cost base, that could be over 300,000 back into the business. Alt21 are so confident that they offer the best value in the market. They show you how much they make from fees in real time before and after any transaction. If you want to save your organisation money on its foreign exchange and hedging, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Nuala. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Nuala, a board search specialist and market leader bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Nuala Walsh, is NED at British and Irish Lions and Basketball Ireland, Chair of Innocence Project London, Founding Director of the Global Association of Behavioural Scientists, President of the Harvard Club of Ireland, Advisor at World Athletics, Council Member at the Football Association, and former Vice Chair of UN Women UK. Nuala is founder and CEO of Mind Equity, where she advises on strategy, reputation, culture, behaviour change. She's an adjunct professor of behavioural science at Trinity College Dublin, best-selling author of Tune In, a TEDx speaker and fellow at the London School of Economics. Nuala, a huge welcome and thank you for joining us today.
It's great to be here, Oliver. Thank you very much.
In Tune In, you highlight how we have never faced a more noisy world full of distraction, disinformation, and data overload. And as a result, we are failing to hear who or what really matters, resulting in bad decisions. You reference the trilogy of errors, the three overarching categories of judgment mistakes that lead to poor decisions. For those not familiar with that trilogy, can you just bring them to life for me?
Sure, Oliver. And it's quite new, to be fair. So sometimes I call it the trilogy of terror because of the consequences that it has for business and indeed for those affected. So maybe just by way of context, I do argue in the book that the biggest risk isn't economic, political or climate risk, but it is decision risk and the failure to hear who and what really matters, as he said, triggered by this. But the result is that we hear less and we misjudge more than ever. And boards, as well as everybody else, tunes out these inconvenient signals, messages, or whatever they think is uncomfortable, particularly when they're under pressure or uncertain. And whether it's conscious or not, at the root of this is unconscious bias and this trilogy of error, as you refer to. And basically the trilogy of error is a combination of blind spots, deaf spots, and dumb spots. And the first of these blind spots, people have heard of these. And it really is around the idea that what you see is all there is, or what is not all there is. And to give it some context, I've been involved in several mergers, and in each case, a combination of ego, overconfidence, self-interest, or short-termism normally dominates the decision. And it's kind of why 80% of them actually fail. But it's not just mergers. Blind spots appear in every type of decision. So even if you go back to Silicon Valley's blood testing failure, Theranos, board members and investors tuned in to the voice of the former CEO and now convicted felon Elizabeth Holmes. Most people took her claims at face value. Why? Because it's a visual world and we rely on first impressions, particularly if it's an attractive messenger with a very compelling story. And this leads me to the second problem, is the deaf spots. We basically rely on what we see, not what we hear. And this is a term that refers to our failure to interpret what people say or don't say. But of course, not everything you hear is valuable and not everything valuable is heard, particularly in the boardroom. And again, if you just go back to Theranos, the board was decorated with really distinguished dignitaries, but they weren't industry experts. They wanted to be associated with success. They believed the data. They didn't question what they heard. They defaulted to truth. And even former US Secretary of State George Shultz, you may remember, turned a deaf ear when warned by his grandson, Tyler Shultz, about everything that was going on. But not everybody did that. Whereas the grandson was a whistleblower, in effect, many people were complicit. And that is sort of the third problem that boards face and organisations face, which is when people remain silent and don't speak up. So these are what I've called dumb spots. What you say is rarely all there is. And people become complicit in this silence and don't raise red flags. And again, it's not just Theranos. You've seen it everywhere. You see it on the boards of Boeing. You saw it with the Madoff Ponzi scheme. People just tuned out Harry Markopoulos, the well-known whistleblower. And when people do speak up, then they face retribution, a lesson I think Jess Staley of Barclays learned only too well. So it's easy to turn a deaf ear. But the problem is, of course, that when people do it subconsciously, this is when the problem turns up. But it is a problem because only a quarter of people think that their organisations make great decisions, according to McKinsey, and less than half say that their decisions are timely. So it is a real problem at board level, the three of these different types of errors, because they're all unconscious.
So for a board member listening to this, thinking, gosh, am I guilty of any of those? How would they know?
Well, firstly, they are guilty because they're human, and there are 200 of these. The problem is if you look at any of the studies done by Accenture or anyone else, typically people think that they are immune from bias and they think that they are good decision makers because they haven't had a major catastrophe to date, or at least that they know of. So the problem is that you have to assume that first. And until you accept the fact that you are liable for these traps, and the more senior you are, the greater the consequentiality of your error. So that is where most people have that risk of impacting so many others. And it doesn't matter whether you're the board of Grenfell, whether you're in NASA, whether you're on a public board, a private board, the more power you hold, I argue, the greater the responsibility and the moral obligation for people not to get these decisions wrong. And so they need some kind of organising framework because there are 200 of these biases that people really just need to be more aware of.
Okay, help us then understand how we can get better at identifying when we are making these judgment mistakes, because you developed your perimeters framework to synthesize those 75 plus biases and make it easier to spot when we are at risk of flawed decisions as a result of those.
Yeah, and Oliver, I did it for exactly that reason, because there's too many and we're never going to remember them. So I wanted it to be simple, and I chose the word deliberately. So it's a mnemonic called perimeters, and it's 10 factors where we frequently bias our own perspective in the boardroom and outside of the boardroom. And each trap has 6 or 7 different biases associated. And each of these is a source of misinformation, whether you're deciding whether to merge, divest, strategize, invest, etc. So maybe I'll just run through them very briefly. So it's a one-liner on each. The first one is about power. So people typically elevate the voice of idols, CEOs, chairs, fellow peers or experts. And when you do that, you give away your own power and you narrow your frame of thinking. You conform, you are vulnerable to authority bias, champion bias, many of these different biases that play into the power domain. Ego-based traps are easier to recognize, and when you recklessly overvalue or overcommit to your own voice above anyone else's idea or opinion. And that's all about the illusion of validity, the illusion of superiority, invulnerability. You think nothing will happen to you. You think you know it all, or that you have the curse of expertise. And we can probably relate to that and spot many people who have that one. Risk-based traps are all about your appetite for sensation seeking, your intolerance of doubt or uncertainty. But it also is when you pursue too much sensation or too little sensation seeking and you don't acknowledge or recognize enough risk. Identity-based traps are all about this insatiable craving to impress others with your curated self-image, whether you're on LinkedIn or Facebook or X or wherever. But in the boardroom, it's slightly different. You want to be market leading. You want to be the company that's first to market or fastest to market, or that has the greatest longevity. So it plays to different dimensions, whether you're an individual or whether you're an organization or whether you're a society. And again, in there, you're looking at issues like impression management or consistency bias or in-group and out-group bias plays in there. Then you've got memory-based traps, which is all about your ability to recall data, conversations and events. But at a board level, you're making decisions based on the past. Some companies have a history of really successful mergers. So guess what? They do another one. And it's completely for the wrong reasons, and it fails because they're relying on historical decisions rather than current state. Ethics are obvious. It's about the ability to resist temptation, do the right thing. Unfortunately, there are so many scandals littering Wall Street of companies who have got that one wrong. Time-based traps are about the tendency to overweight the past, the present, or the future. And of course, there you have companies that are stuck in the past, that are so gung-ho with the future they get it wrong, or that they just don't recognize enough when they're making short-term decisions versus long-term. Emotional-based traps, again, these really do hit the boardroom. As an individual basis, there are 27 different biases, but at a board level, it's sort of about envy. You've got the regret effect, you regret aversion, you have the ostrich effect where you just bury your head in the sand and you don't listen to the bad news. Or you've got the underdog effect where you're number 2 and you're desperate to be number 1. What decisions will you make in order to reach that level? And again, we can point to many examples of companies that have just taken the wrong path. Relationship-based traps are about herding, delegating your decisions to the crowd. And again, there are examples there from social comparison, groupthink, preference falsification. And then the story-based traps are, again, very easy to explain all of these. It's about the readiness to accept the narrative that you hear. And of course, at a board table, you listen to the executive's story. They come in and you listen to these choreographed pitches and these wrapped up bows, stories. And it's easy to just nod along. And again, it's all about how people present the information, who presents the information, what they look like, whether you believe them in the past. And this outcome bias is resulting that we can talk about how recent the information is and what you remember. I've seen all of these play out in the boardroom in different configurations. And the more at risk you are, the more you fail to see that these are liabilities and very real liabilities, the more at risk not only you as a director are, but your organization and indeed the customers, employees and shareholders within your sphere of influence.
That last one reminds me of a discussion I was having recently around leadership and manager development in an organization. And the point being made was that leaders and managers in general spend 95% of their time worrying about what they're saying. And yet those receiving what they're saying will spend 95% of their time looking at what they do and how they behave. And there's this sort of disconnect of the bias of what people think is going to have an impact and the stories they're telling versus the stories that people are hearing, which is based on their actual behaviors.
It's absolutely right, Oliver. And, from a neuroscience perspective, you can only hear 25% of what people are saying anyway. You can only retain it. We forget half of it. And that's just reality. So you're absolutely right. It's like us all obsessing about the words we use when we present. And, there are other theories that say that people only get 7% of that. It's all about how you say it, but yet we obsess about our word choice. And having written a book, I can tell you I do obsess about the word choice, but people only get so little of what you've said. We do forget it in business, and it's a very useful reminder.
Particularly terrifying in the board where you have so little time to repeat things.
Yes, you're absolutely right. There's the pressure to either sign things off or rubber stamp things. And then you don't have time with a packed agenda to actually explore and ask the executives, what are they really saying and what do they mean?
Okay, so for a board member listening to this, they've got the concept of the perimeters. How and when do they know when to use this?
The answer is all the time, Oliver, and particularly when you're making a high-stakes decision. Now, you might say every board decision is a high-stakes decision. Sometimes it depends on the board. Sometimes they are and sometimes they're not. But the more consequential the decision that somebody is making at a board level, the more long-term it is, the more it's going to affect other people, the more they should be using this. Because as we've said already, everybody is liable to this. And of course, when you're in a group, you are more vulnerable to this than ever because we people please. We want to impress whoever we're speaking to. We don't want to be the dissenter. We don't want to be the unpopular board member or that troublemaker who always has that awkward question. Now, some people are okay with that, but most people are not. So you do need to look at this. It should be part of everybody's DNA to just even go through this. I use this all the time on a board or outside of a board. And I really do think it's something that you can keep for life. no matter what decision you're making that matters to you or that affects other people, I really do think that it's something that will stand you in really useful stead for your whole life.
It feels potentially like one of those things, a bit like, and you referenced the work of Atul Gandhi and checklists save lives, that actually the discipline of going through each of these systematically with a pen and paper every time you have a key decision will presumably increase your chances of making a better decision, much more so than just simply keeping it in the back of your mind. What are you doing as a board member? Are you going through every time there's a key decision, ticking these off, or are you sufficiently fluent with them you feel you don't need that?
Personally, I'm fluent with them and I would know them. So where my homework would come in, I would want to go back, because there are 200 biases. What I do is I go and say, which ones are they? So what I would do, I would go to the trouble and say, if I hear it, is I would be able to call out. So if there is 275 in the book, I might know off the top of my head at half of those that I could easily reference just at a moment's notice. But I would probably look and say, well, is it really a combination of X and Y and Z? So I would want to point out to which one it is. Is it the Hawthorne effect? So we change our behaviour when people are watching us, for example. So I would want to be able to specifically label it, because when you label it, people will learn and people will take it on board a lot quicker than if I just say, oh, it's a identity-related bias, or it's a bias, even more. So I lower and lower so that I can name the trap and then tell them a bit of a story about the Hawthorne effect, for example. And I find that's the only way that people will do it. But you're right, it is a discipline, but people think it's fun. I mean, it's not fun if you get it wrong, but the fun factor is in at least being able to pinpoint. And people at boards are very clever people, and they all want to be seen as very clever. And if they're able to point to someone's behaviour, and you can practice on really small things. You can practice in the house when your partner is saying something or your mother is saying something. You can relate it to any kind of decision. And then you get into the habit, exactly as you say, you get into the discipline of doing it. But at a board level, you have to do this. It should be on the list. It's not on very few boards that I've ever sat on. They don't talk about decision risk. Of course they don't. Because there is that arrogance at board level to think that we get it right. And it's only when things go wrong that people can then retrofit. But doing a pre-mortem and looking at these in advance is the only way to avoid, is to comfortably avoid getting things wrong. And I do put a guarantee in the book, and I come from investment management, and you're not allowed to guarantee anything, of course, in investments. But I do guarantee one thing, Oliver, and that is, I don't guarantee that you're going to get every decision right, but I do guarantee that you're going to make fewer errors by using this framework than if you didn't bother at all. And again, going back to use it in a very simple way. It's not difficult. The words are easy. The ideas are simple. They're easily relatable to people. And I think it doesn't matter what level you're at that you can use these.
Is there a parallel there, though, with those aircraft pilots or those surgeons who said, we don't need checklists, we're experts in this field, and yet the data showed that more lives were saved, there were fewer plane crashes when they did use those checklists? When you say, actually, I know these well enough not to need the checklist, is there a risk that you're suffering that same bias?
It's not that I know them well enough not to use the checklist. It's that I would be more familiar with them. And my point is, I'm probably more guilty of some of these than most people because I'm watching them all the time now. The point is, the checklist is needed when you don't have any familiarity with it. So I'm saying that over time, you will become more familiar with them. More familiar does not mean that you're not going to be at risk. More familiar only means that you are more likely to at least say, okay, now I'm more familiar with myself that I'm liable to do this. I'm going to check what should I be doing and asking myself. So if I need to make a big decision myself, what I will do is I'll run through them in my head and I will say, well, that's probably, so let's just say I've written a book. Let's just say I'm trying to decide, will I write a second book? I will say, well, is that, it's not power-based because, it doesn't give you power. Is it ego-based? Is it identity-based? Is it emotional-based? Because I loved the first one, I might love the second one. Is it because the crowd are telling you to? Not that they are, but is it because you're glory hunting? Or is it that I have a really important message that I want to get out, call it in book 2? So I would explore my reason and I would go through that list and ask myself, and if I think, well, it's misjudgment trap A or B, I would dig a lot deeper to say, well, what is it? So I do my own diagnostic and then to really probe the decision before you make the decision. then I would go through each of those and say, well, which ones do I think it is? But you can only do that when you're aware of what it stands for and you are willing to invest the time so that you don't kind of make the wrong decision and either waste time, your life, money, resources, and impact other people, because every decision you make impacts other people, regardless of where you sit.
Well, let's talk about the antidote. And you have a recommended approach for people once they have identified the biases that they are being guilty of, how they overcome those. What does that look like in the boardroom?
Yeah, and I think the first thing that before you even look at the antidote is to spot the warning signals. And the warning signals, I think, are kind of easy to spot. So even off the top of my head, if we just list a few. So a board that rewards short-term behaviour under crisis or short-term results, flag 1. Flag 2, a board that doesn't invest in anti-bias education, assuming omnipotence, is flag 2. Flag 3 would be a board that doesn't monitor their own behaviours we were talking about a minute ago, the herding dynamics. A board that obsesses about wanting more data before they make a decision, Oliver, is also, for me, a red flag. And then a board who falls over the CEO or has too tight a relationship with the chair and the CEO is another red flag. One red flag that I noticed was when I was joining a board, they almost boasted about being a consensus-driven board. And for me, that just said their desire for harmony or conflict avoidance. So the antidote is to, 1, be willing enough to at least watch for those red flags and recognize them. And then I have what I did in the book was, so you have the perimeters, which is your initial diagnostic. Am I at risk or am I not? And then the solution is all about what I've called decision friction. Friction is typically something that's negative. If you're doing a subscription online and you can't get out of it, that is not a seamless experience in most cases. And that is unwelcome friction. But in this case, deliberate friction slows you down long enough. And studies have shown that, of course, when you slow down, you make better decisions, apart from except if it's in an emergency situation. So this idea of decision friction in a boardroom is about deliberately interrupting either your thoughts or the thoughts of other people before forming a judgment. So in real terms, it's just a series of conscious prompts or nudges or rules or questions that you can ask in the boardroom. And it's very easy. So you might ask yourself about, have you got too many options or too few options? Have you conducted any of these, other tools like De Bono's thinking hats? And I've put together 18 different science-based strategies that people can use. And they're very easy. Some boards will use some more than others. But for example, the De Bono's thinking hats is a really easy example that companies and boards can use to work through a decision. So instead of taking the negative view, they might have the positive, the optimistic view or the pessimistic view or the risk person's view or the regulator's view or the investor's view. So you take, and you can decide whatever the 6 hats are that matter most to you in your organization. And it's just having diversity of perspective.
Well, there are examples from your own experience on boards where you've been able to help a board reach a better decision by helping them think differently.
Well, I'm not the shrink on the board, as it were. So I have to play my role as a board member. So all I can do is, so I'll give you the example of that board where it was a consensus-driven board and I was brought in as an independent. I had no axe to grind. I had nothing to gain. But one decision did come up and it was very clearly going in one direction. And I did ask myself before I went into that meeting, well, it's a bit uncomfortable. I'm only new. Will I give my view? And I was against this particular deal. And anyway, I decided I would. And what I was watching around the table was in what order, were people going to speak? And we had one meeting where it was quite clear I was actually the only dissenter on this piece. So, and then of course they went off and they got more data, to validate the view that they wanted already. And in this final decision-making meeting, we were going to make the decision one way or the other. The only thing that I was able to do was to try and, get people to speak up and cast their view, to reflect on this, cast their view a little bit differently, to see, and so I did raise it in the first meeting. I said, I sort of laughed, said, well, given that I'm the only dissenter here, maybe we can all think about this and look at this from these different perspectives before we take the final vote. Knowing that I was going into this final vote with my only view. I really doubted that anyone would have changed their mind, because I do believe in confirmation bias, and I think very few people do change their mind. But anyway, the long and short of it is, they did, 2 other groups did change their mind. So I wasn't the only dissenter. There were 3 of us, but we were outvoted, Oliver. But I felt that in some way I at least encouraged some to think a little bit different about whatever the topic was, and at least come to a slightly different view when they came to make the final vote. So whereas my preferred view didn't win the vote, we at least had, I think, a more healthy debate, and it was quite a vociferous debate about the topic, rather than just having that original consensus board. And they said, oh, we always do. We always speak to people, and we make sure we have consensus. And in this case, there wasn't consensus. So I was slightly pleased that at least I had, helped them or shown them that it's not the end of the world to have a different view. It's actually quite a good thing. So that may be my latest example.
That's a great example. And actually, it's very illustrative of a common challenge. We see lots of the participants in our mastermind groups who are part of the Nuala Plus community wrestling, which is something we've called Cassandra syndrome, where they have a clear sense of what the right answer is. They think they do, whether that's bias or not. Obviously, you don't always get to see, but they have a clear sense, and they fail to take the group with them. Obviously, you're an expert in decision-making. Really interested to hear, as you retrospect that example, was there anything that you think you could have done differently that might have resulted in a different outcome?
Well, by a different outcome, do you mean that they all agreed with me?
Or at least the majority agreed with you, so that you got the decision that you thought was the right one?
I'll tell you what led it was politics and self-interest, because it's all about how the board is composed. And I think that's another very important lesson. How the board is composed in particular situations so when people are voting for self-interest, it has a particular outcome. I think everybody wanted to do the right thing. This did come down to a bit of a judgment call. They tried to, I don't think there was anything, I certainly wasn't in the market for, hey, you must all agree with me because, whatever. I'm there to give an opinion. So for me, the right thing is to speak my mind, give a view, a considered view, give the pros and cons. And when you do that, you at least give people the opportunity to think a little bit differently. And I did consider, and I tell you what, I learned differently. So on other boards, not that board, I sat on another board and I spoke first. And sometimes when you speak first, it can be a mistake. And I was definitely the only person who said, so I said no to something first, and then everyone was giving a yes, and it was a supplier. And so anyway, so I said no, but by the end of it, Oliver, I actually listened to all of their views, and I thought, okay, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we can do A and B. So I felt that I had learned from having listened to everybody else's view, and the board then decided, well, I was the chair of this particular board. So, and at the end, we decided that actually the right thing was yes, that we would go ahead with whatever, but under certain conditions. So my value add was under certain conditions that we all agreed were useful, but it wasn't a consensus driven board. It was, well, we think that this is the right thing to do. So you do learn from listening to other people. But if you go in gung-ho with a very firm, fixed view, I think it could be really dangerous. And I've seen it. People just won't budge because they think it's ego-driven and they think they lose face if they change their mind. Whereas actually, it's okay to change your mind. People normally have more respect for you if you do, rather than just dig your heels in, particularly at board level, when these decisions really matter.
Your example reminds me of a situation I faced on an investment committee where I was convinced that we shouldn't be investing in this particular deal, which I was convinced would go on or had the potential to go under within 3 months. And I failed to convince as on every investment committee, there's normally a thought leader, and I failed to convince the thought leader. And unfortunately, they did the deal. And unfortunately, in less than 3 months, the business went under, which gave me no pleasure because I thought, what could I have done differently? And the thing that I realized in retrospect was that the reason the thought leader was backing this particular deal was because they were supporting the individual leading it. They weren't looking at the actual economics of the deal rationally. It was an emotional, and maybe that was a sort of political decision. Is that politics-based bias one that you can't solve, or is there a solution to that? If you were sort of advising me as a board member in that situation again, how to overcome that bias, what can I do?
I probably would have analysed the different, what's his real agenda. Everything is about motivated reasoning. So the reason people pick a position is either that they it's in their self-interest, or maybe they know something you don't. So in either case, you want to know that. These are the skills of influence, really, aren't they? You need to know what's driving somebody. And if you can understand it doesn't mean you're going to change their mind. You may or may not. But if you appeal to people's rational self-interest, I find it always works. So when something is political, there's usually reputation involved. Now, assuming it's not a financially motivated reason where you probably have no hope, of countering if it's financially involved. But if you can find a reputation angle, everyone cares about their reputation. And if you can find a way to point out two things, one, the reputation risk to that individual, save the planet, for example. And you can find an example where they have said publicly, it's really important to save the planet, or some such equivalent, phraseology. If you can appeal back to, do you remember when you talked about the importance of climate change? And this is really important. And I mean, go back to whatever the issue is that you're talking about. Find somewhere that they have said in the past, because people have consistency bias. And when you point out, I remember when you said something was really important, well, this is very consistent with that. Or you find an angle that I think it's quite a clever way. And I have used this. I've used this when I wanted people to do things, for me. As I've gone back to find things when they said, this is really important to me. And you use that and you remind them how they said, this is very important, whatever it is, whether it's climate change or whatever. And you find something and that works because they're consistent and they will remember, they will trigger, yes, I did say that and that really matters. And okay, this isn't quite exactly the same, but it's very similar too. And I think that can be, I would suggest that you do that beyond any of the 7 principles of influence that Robert Cialdini teaches us to employ, which are fantastic.
So actually, it's an interesting, because I suppose decision-making, what's becoming clear to me listening to you, is decision-making is actually only half the battle and goes hand in hand with that influence that Cialdini is so good on. Are there elements of the perimeters framework that you can reverse engineer that are more powerful ways of influencing than others?
I would look at it slightly differently, Oliver. I think when you understand the perimeters model, you have massive influence because you understand people. You understand how people think. You understand how to use them. So whereas they're negative, they're also a positive. By understanding them, you can twist quite a few of these to gain influence. And that is what Robert does incredibly well.
Right, but are there some that are more powerful than others? So if I said to you, I'm going to give you a shot at persuading this individual, okay, you can use 3 biases or 3 insights around bias to do it. Which would be your 3 bets around the ones that are most likely to unlock them? Or is it more situation specific?
No, I would use messenger effect as my number 1. Who's the messenger? Does this person like you or not? If they don't like you, you've no hope, Oliver. So people are influenced by the messenger effect. And you have to have 3 characteristics. Likability, credibility, and familiarity. So you might be very smart. So you've got credibility. You might be very familiar. So he might know you, like you, look like you. So that's the familiarity bias, that we all listen to people who are like us. But he may not like you, okay? I'm making this up. But you may have no likability. He may actually dislike you intensely. So you aren't going to influence him at all. So unless you have a combination of these 3, it's just not going to work. And I'll give you an example. I don't know if you remember the Menendez brothers trial. There was a woman called Leslie Abrahamson, and her job was to get, her clients off. But the jury said that the jury was very divided. She had credibility, she had familiarity in most cases, but she didn't have likability. They just didn't like her. And there was a hung jury, and it was a gender split in this case. She was a bit too abrasive for them, and there was a complete likability. So her influence on the jury was completely limited. So where she had these other 2, when it came to the men just didn't like her. Okay, so her influence was limited. So number 1, I would pick the messenger effect because it works all the time.
Before you go on to the 2 and 3, if a board member, I'm trying to think of the implications of that, is the implication, and I've seen this actually, people talking about doing this in our mastermind groups, where they get somebody else to deliver the message who is likable or has the bit that they're missing.
Yes, you can do that. You need to think about who is doing it. You're absolutely right. There is no point in you, Oliver, going to that individual if that individual, just, and it's not just pick someone who likes you. It's not that simple. Because it's about the timing, It's about what order information is presented in. So I would also urge you to look at what's called the serial position effect, which is the order in which you present information to people as to whether they listen to it or not. And with that is I would also look at, and these are, as you say, reversing these, the communication effects, like the primacy effect or the recency effect. So which order are you telling people in and what will they remember? So there's also the availability bias. And marketeers love this, of course, because the availability bias is what is top of mind with you? What are you going to remember? What is told in the right way? So to influence, if you aren't aware of availability bias combined with saliency and you use it to your advantage, you probably are on to a bit of a loser. They are the most powerful techniques, and marketers do it all the time. Politicians do it all the time. Therapists use it sometimes to get people to behave in a certain way. So this is the art of behavioural science. And again, depending on what the problem is, behavioural science will point to a number of different appeals to get people to do things, and the emotion effects. So, for example, during COVID, governments used the emotional appeal, to think of your neighbour. They didn't use fear. They almost used hope. So it was wear masks, save lives. And that was a positive appeal rather than don't wear a mask, kill your neighbour, for example. So it was a positive rather than a negative fear-based appeal. And these work.
So for those who are not familiar with those two, can you just spell them out?
It's called the serial position effect. And so that's the second one. And then the third one, as I said, you can use, it's called the recency effect or it's called the primacy effect. One is what you remember first and the other one is what you remember last. Obviously, what you say first or last.
Understood. Was it the availability and salience for the two you said were the big ones?
Well, I think they're all combined, actually. Maybe the third one you can say availability bias is what you remember straight away. So people remember what is available. So if there's a car crash or if there's a plane crash, so for example, after 9/11, people were afraid to fly, even though more people died in car crashes. So what is available is what is easily recalled and is what is salient, as in top of mind. So they all go together, I'm afraid, Oliver, but they're easy enough. They're easy enough to look up and I think to remember if you're trying to influence people. So I would suggest looking at those, thinking about those in any communication that you make, written or verbal. So if I tell you a really shocking story now, it will have availability bias and you will remember it. For example, it will be salient and top of mind.
Got it. So I guess in that example where I was trying to persuade that key thought leader on the investment committee, perhaps one of the things I should have tried was to just talk through a couple of investments that had blown up and made sure those were front of mind and available before they made that decision on the new one.
Absolutely right. And then you would have thought, in your mind, you would have looked at, well, which story will I tell him first? Primacy. Which will I tell him last? Recency. So you will use all of these tools and then who will tell him, which is the messenger effect. So you will combine any of these. So remember, these biases, A, you can use them to your advantage, or B, you can understand them to avoid making mistakes. So they're a two-sided coin. Of course, there's a danger, but on the positive side, you can use them to gain influence. But in aggregate, the more you understand them, of course, the more you can use them to your advantage, and you have an advantage that other people don't have. So we go back to the beginning, Oliver, and people, as I said, 96% of people think they're immune from bias and think they're great decision makers. Well, the people who know that they're not have that advantage automatically over other people. And that is a huge asset when you sit on a board.
Yeah, that's a great echo of Dan Gardner, who was a past Enter the Boardroom guest who made exactly that point as well, that most people think they can avoid biases and it's just not the case. You're going to experience the bias and the question is just, can you raise your awareness of it?
Yes, and can you mitigate it? So you might be aware of it and you might miss it the first time or the second time, but exactly as you said earlier on, you get into that discipline, it becomes a habit, you'll never conquer it forever, but you'll at least start to spot it and you can do something about it and avoid error for yourself and other people.
Now, the time is flying. Before we go on to the lightning round, I'd love to just talk a little bit about how you've gone about building your board career. It reminds me in some ways a little bit of past guest Jane Routledge in episode 40, who talked about how she built her portfolio career as someone who'd come from a marketing background. I'm really interested to hear how you thought about building yours, where you've combined paid consultancy roles with pro bono board roles.
Yeah, I don't think the background matters to an extent. I have a very diverse skill set, and public boards and leaders seem to like that. I started early. I started before I was in corporate life in UN Women, and then I progressed to investment boards, sports boards and human rights. And I think it's easy to join a board for the perceived kudos. It's a lot less than people might think, money or CV building. That rarely works out. For me, I try to blend these paid and pro bono roles, like the Innocence Project, where they fight to free the wrongfully convicted. Last month I had the opportunity to interview an exoneree from death row, and I can tell you there are plenty of lessons about resilience and goal focus that board members can learn from them. But be that as it may, when I think about my portfolio, I really just care about the impact that I can have with the greatest reach and whether the board is receptive to the skill set. And if there is an appetite to use behavioural insight, whether it's to help the executives or board level, then there is a match. And unfortunately, nowadays, I think most boards are interested in culture and applying a behavioural lens because they're under scrutiny, because they're being held to account, and because, as I say, Bloomberg is rating these skills as important as data-driven skills. So, for me, the value for that is just avoiding this predictable error. So it was very conscious in the beginning, and now it's more, what is the best fit and which boards are really interested in, adding a behavioural science layer to their board.
It reminds me a little bit also of another of my favourite episodes with Terry Duhon in episode 9, where she talked about the challenge of when she was first looking to get a board role. She got told to get a board role, you need a board role, and she thought that was a bit mad. And she went off and wrote a book and then got a role as a professor and subsequently joined the board of CHAPS before being invited to join the board of WISE, which was a FTSE 100, I think, at the time. Really interested to hear what your experience has been. Has your book and your professor work, academic work, helped with your board positioning?
I think it's too early to tell, to be honest, Oliver. The most recent endeavours, I guess it'll depend on whether someone likes the book and is interested in human behaviour or not. As I said earlier, I think my psychology orientation helped me get on one particular board because the chair happened to really appreciate the value of human misinformation. I got lucky in one respect, but that was before the book was out. That was before the professorship. So I don't think writing a book or lecturing equates to being a better board member. I think these are useful credibility stamps, probably, as Terry said. For me, it's about common sense and an independent mind. And I think that matters as much as the ability to strip out what's logical versus psychological. So time will tell, Oliver, and I'll let you know.
Looks like you're on a great path. And Nuala, time has flown by, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to say a statement and ask you for a quick response if you're ready. First up, best book every board member should read and why?
I think that's a planted question, Oliver. Well, it's Tune In, How to Make Smarter Decisions in a Noisy World by my good self.
Boardroom behaviour that irritates you most.
Choreographed papers where the argument is so wrapped up with a bow, the executives think they'll bulldoze board members into a certain direction.
Most valuable board ritual.
The combination of the informal social events with the formal events.
Favourite quote.
Quite a lot recently. I'm going to go for the Cherokee proverb, listen to the whispers and you don't have to hear the screams, which of course plays to the art of reinterpretation.
Most significant professional insight.
I'm going to say that I don't have one right now because these change all the time. Over time, these have changed, and I think it's based on what level you're at and what situation you're facing.
Best professional advice you've ever received.
Oh, you're going to be irritated now because I'm not going to give you no single nugget for that one either, because I think when I first started my career, I got one piece. I got them throughout my career. Now at board level, I think there are other ones. I will just say one thing, that one of the most useful pieces of advice I got towards the end of my exec career was to be careful of boards, that the rules of the board change when you get to that level. And I found that quite useful.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
And again, this plays to time maybe. The rules of the game change at board level. And I used to think that it was an omniscient group. And I now realize that there is often, in some cases, too much power condensed into the hands of too few.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
I would know when to weigh in and when not to. That some things are worth arguing about and some things aren't. So now I would add in, I always give my opinion when asked, but I think I would be more considered about when to really take a firm stand and when not to.
Finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this podcast if they take nothing else.
Firstly, maybe that as board members, your decisions matter far more than you may think. And I think it's important. Ronald Reagan once said, trust but verify. I would probably say distrust but verify. And so that for me is probably number 1. Number 2 is nobody is immune. You might sit on a board, but in actual fact, the more successful you are, the more vulnerable you are, and the more people who will pay the price for your error. So remember that nobody is immune. And maybe for the third one, I would say that the smartest thing you can know is who to listen to and who not to. And I'll go back to my favourite phrase that not everything you hear is valuable and not everything valuable is heard, but it needs to be. So maybe use this framework, let it become a habit, because it's not just for Christmas. I think it's something that will serve people well for their whole life.
Nuala, my mind is swirling. Thank you for a hugely stimulating discussion and for sharing your incredible wisdom and experience.
Thank you very much, Oliver. It's been fun.
Building a non-exec career is hard. For those starting out, boards can be opaque. For more experienced board members, it can be lonely and hard to stay match fit. Having placed almost 4,000 people on boards in the last 5 years, we know what success looks like. It requires time, energy, resilience, information, and connections. New Role Plus, our community of board peers, exists to give you these things, offering you wholesale support as you try to get board roles and become a standout Ned. Find out more at newrole.com/newrole-plus. That's newrole.com/newrole-plus.